Welcome everyone to this free GMAT prep hour on October 11th. Please let me know if you can hear me. We have a chat box. We also have a Q&A. The Q&A is for you to ask me questions that you definitely want me to see. The chat box is for you all to communicate with each other and to answer questions that I ask you. So if you go in there and let me know, you can hear me, you can see me, you can see the slide that I'm presenting that says free GMAT prep hour with my picture. So we're all good to go. Welcome everyone. So today I'd like to talk about reading comprehension. So before we get started, I'll just put the slide up for a few seconds, let you know about different options that we have with Manhattan Prep. While we wait for a few more people to join. And so here's what we're going to talk about today. So firstly, I think it's important to understand why is there reading comprehension on the GMAT. Obviously, we have already graduated from some sort of undergraduate degree. We know how to read English. We've been tested on reading comprehension before. Why does the GMAT need to test this? So we'll talk about that first. Then I want to talk about how we ought to read reading comprehension passages, and we'll find out that that's a very different kind of reading from what we do normally in our everyday life. I'm getting, can anybody else hear me other than Salma? Let me know in the chat box if you can hear me. Annie can hear me. Okay, so Salma, it looks like, just type that to Salma in the chat box because she can't hear me. All right. Now, after we talk about that, I want to look at some detailed questions and see what are some strategies to answer those kinds of questions, and we'll end with takeaways. So why is there reading comprehension in the GMAT? The GMAT is supposed to be a test to test our readiness to go to business school, to become executives or consultants. This is meant to be just a free hour to share with the world things that Manhattan Prep instructors have learned over time. It is not necessarily for advanced students. It can be for advanced students. It can also be for people who have never looked at a GMAT question in their lives. So I think everyone can benefit from what we're going to do in this hour. I'll remind you, if you have a question that you want to make sure that I see, because I'm not necessarily going to see everything in the chat box, that's what the Q&A is for. So as I was saying, the GMAT is designed to test our readiness for business school to become executives or consultants. And so we need to think about how consultants read. How do executives read? So I think of someone like Steve Jobs, who didn't have any real background in computer hardware or computer software, but he had thousands and thousands of computer engineers reporting to him. And they would write memos, and they would write project proposals. They would ask for funding. Maybe they want $20 million to do some research and development. And these memos and project proposals that Steve Jobs would get, they would be super technical. Most of the stuff, I would say probably 80 to 90% of the text would be stuff that Steve would not be able to understand. And yet, as a senior executive, you would have to still be able to get the gist of it. Understand who wrote this, why did he write it, what does he want, and then make a decision based on that. So that's going to require a very different kind of reading from what you're used to. When you're reading Harry Potter, you're not wondering, why did J.K. Rowling write this? You're trying to immerse yourself in the magical world of Harry Potter. When you're reading a history book in high school, preparing for a history test, and the history textbook goes into the 5 factors that led to World War I. You're not wondering, why did the author of this book choose to share with the reader what were the 5 factors that led to World War I? That's not what you're asking yourself. You're busy taking notes of what were the 5 factors, because you might get asked that tomorrow on your test. The GMAT is not that kind of test. The GMAT is a test where you do want to wonder, why is the author telling me this? What difference does it make? Why does the author need the reader to know that there were 5 factors, and what were those 5 factors? So we're much more interested in why the author is giving us this information than we are in the information itself. And so we probably want to read on the GMAT somewhere around 60 to 70% of the, 30 to 40% of the text. Most of the text we do not want to read, just like Steve Jobs wouldn't read most of the text in those memos. And consultants, one day you're doing a project in the retail industry, then a month later you're doing a project in the manufacturing industry. You're not a subject matter expert. A lot of the stuff you're reading, you don't really understand, but you can read between the lines, you can understand who wrote it and what the purpose was. And that's really the important thing. So then the next question we need to ask is, so how do you decide which 30 to 40% you're reading and which 60 to 70% you're not reading? How do you make that determination? So I'd like you all to chip in here in the chat box and give me some ideas. How do we know, oh, this is a chunk of text that I probably don't need to read? Oh, this is a piece of text that I think is important. How do you make that call? Let's get some participation here. So I'm seeing a pretty good suggestion from Annie. I would say that strategy, so for those of you watching this on YouTube, Annie wrote, just read the first and maybe last sentence of each paragraph. That works fairly often. It's not going to get you into the 700s, but it's not a bad strategy right off the bat. Ken, that's great. So Ken is saying when the passage gives an example. So now we're going into examples. I'm not interested in examples. What I am interested in is that the author decided to provide an example. What exactly the example says, I don't care. The fact that the author decided to share an example, that's interesting, because that tells me that the author believed an example should be shared. Usha says, reading questions first that need to be answered, then reading the paragraph. So that's an interesting idea, Usha. Let's talk about that for a second. So when the passage pops up on the screen for the first time in the middle of the test, there will already be a question right next to it. I can go ahead and read that question, but if that question is asking for a specific detail, then now when I go read the passage, I'm distracted by the fact that I just read a question. And I'm going to kind of hunt for that detail as I'm reading the passage. That's going to make it harder for me to do my job, where my job is to understand why the author wrote this, what the primary purpose was. Now, Usha, if we only had one question per passage, your suggestion would be good, because that's the only question you're going to have on that passage. So you might as well read the question first and then go hunt for it. But if we know we're going to have 3 or 4 questions on the passage, then knowing what the first question is ahead of time, maybe it's better not to, because I just want to read the passage the way that I read a passage, with a focus on why the author wrote this and what his point is. And I don't want to get distracted by whichever happened to be the first question. And Ronak says, when there are chunks of text that you do not understand. That's a great point, Ronak. So for example, scientific details that not everyone knows, great. If I'm seeing a chunk of text that is using words that I'm not familiar with, or is talking about some really specific subject matter that I might not be an expert on, that's an indication that I should not be reading that text. And perhaps ironically, people for whom English is a second or third or fourth language have an advantage on reading comprehension. Surprising, right? They have an advantage because they don't panic when they see a bunch of text that has words they're not familiar with. They're used to that. That happens to them very often because it's not their first language. And so what they do when they see a sentence with a few words that they don't know is they skip that sentence. And it turns out that that's the best strategy for reading and reading comprehension. Whereas if English is your first language and you're doing reading comprehension and there's some words you don't know, you tend to panic. because you're thinking, how am I going to do well if I don't even understand these words? How do I not know these words? This is my first language, etc. So there's actually an advantage to people for whom English is not a first language. All right, so those were all great. I'll give you one more of my own. I mentioned earlier 5 factors that led to World War I. Right? So let's say that we're reading a passage and the author says, World War I was a devastating war. There were 5 factors that led to it, colon. After that colon, what do you think is going to happen? What is the author about to tell us when he says there were 5 factors that led to World War I, colon? The 5 factors, exactly, Annie. You're going to have factor number 1, factor number 2, factor number 3. He's going to list the 5 factors. Now, I might get a question later on asking me about those factors, and I might not. If I get a question on the factors later on, then I'll go read the factors, but I'm not reading them right now. I am not reading the factors in my initial read. What is important to note in my first read of the passage, it's important to note that the author chose to share with the reader the 5 factors that led to World War I. That's important, that I want to get. What were the 5 factors? I don't care right now. If I get a question about them later, then I'll go read them. Does that make sense to you guys? Good. So those are indications for me to start skipping. When I see something like the 5 factors that led to World War I are, all right, I'm just going to skip those factors and read the next thing. So I'm much more interested in what the author is choosing to share than in the actual content of the sharing. I just want big picture. Okay, good. Let's look at a passage. I chose a passage from the free questions on MBA.com, and we're going to look at some questions after we do that passage. I'm going to give you all exactly 3 minutes to read the passage. I think that's probably a lot more than you need, but I don't want you to feel pressured here. I want you to really think about which text do I want to read slowly and thoughtfully, and which text do I want to skip. Let's talk for a second about note-taking before I do that. Should we take notes or should we not take notes? When you take notes in reading comprehension, look at your notes. If your notes have factor 1 that led to World War I, factor 2, factor 3, factor 4, factor 5. In other words, if you look at your notes and you realize, oh, I'm just taking the notes of the details, the stuff that I wasn't even supposed to read, stop taking notes. Your notes are worse than useless. They're distracting you. They're causing you to focus on the wrong stuff. If, on the other hand, your notes are very big picture notes, like the author gave 5 factors that led to World War I. And then you skip on to the next paragraph, right? And so the notes are really big picture. And if you find that taking those notes is helpful to you, go ahead and continue to take those notes. Okay? So I don't think it's a one-size-fits-all. For some people, you should take notes. For some people, you should not. Personally, I do not. I find the act of taking notes distracting, but for some people, it's good. Okay, so 3 minutes, here you go. Okay, so that was 3 minutes. Let me know in the chat box if that was not enough for you. Just curious. Sufficient. Okay. So let's talk about how we should read something like this on the GMAT. We start at the beginning. It says, 2 recent publications offer different assessments of the career of the famous British nurse, FN. I'm getting the sense that this is the reason why the author wrote the passage. There are 2 recent publications, so recent meaning very recently, not long ago. There were 2 different publications, and they offer different assessments of something. So that's interesting. Then it says a book by Anne Summers. So pause there for a second. Is it just me, or do you also think this is probably one of these 2 recent publications? Like publication number 1 is a book by Anne Summers. So here we're getting item number 1 of these 2 items. A book by Anne Summers seeks to debunk the idealizations. And the second thing it seeks to do, it seeks to present a reality at odds with what? With Nightingale's heroic reputation. Can anyone summarize in the chat box, how does Anne Summers feel about Nightingale's heroic reputation? Is she a fan? Is Anne Summers a fan of the heroic reputation, or not? Nice, Abinash. Okay, good. Nice, Danielle. All right. According to Summers, so now we're going to get into some details. If you can already tell at this point that Anne Summers is not a fan of the heroic reputation, should we read what it says past this comma? I agree that we should not, but how far should we skip? Like, where do we start reading again? I mean, I'm looking here and I'm just seeing details, 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 details. I get all the way to the last sentence of the paragraph. This is also details. So I agree with Tabas. I think that's the name, Tabas. I agree. We should just go all the way to the second paragraph. So let me go ahead and just erase all of that. Do you all agree that we can tell more or less what's in there without actually having to read it? How would you say what's in here? Summarize for me what the author used the space for. What was the space used for? You guys are good. I love what I'm seeing in the chat box. Okay. By contrast, the editors of a new volume of Nightingale's letters, so up to here, this is telling us what is the second piece of publication, the second publication. So the first publication was this, and the second publication, I guess it's really just this, right? Well, actually, I'll include the editors because that's the book that we're talking about. That's the publication. Oops. Okay. So what about them? I already know that it's contrast, so probably maybe they are a fan of the heroic reputation. Let's see. View Nightingale as a person who significantly influenced not only her own age, but also subsequent generations. Big fans. What's going on after this period? They highlight her ongoing efforts to reform sanitary conditions. Should I be reading this? And if I should not be reading this, how far should I skip? Wow, we're going to skip all the way to the next paragraph. Okay, I agree. Now, the third paragraph, which is also the last paragraph, it starts with the words, I believe. Who is I? Who believes? Who is I? Ladies and gentlemen, this is the most important part of the passage, because our job is to understand who is the author and why does the author care about this? Why did the author get up in the morning and decide, I'm going to write this passage? So when you see the words, I believe, you need to say, this is the reason the author wrote this, to tell us what he believes, he or she believes. Careful though, Tabas, because the author is not Anne. Anne is the author of publication number 1. The editors are the authors of publication number 2, but the author of the passage is I, whoever that is. I believe that the evidence of her letters, evidence of her letters? Did we know anything about letters? What do we know about letters? Oh, that's this blue publication. The evidence of her letters supports continued respect for Nightingale's brilliance and creativity. Guess what? We now know who the author agrees with. Do we want to read this next sentence? Let me see. I don't know yet. I need to look. When counseling a village schoolmaster, what? What is he talking about? What is that? That's an indication that I should skip. So this is a skip. Her insistence on classifying the problems of the needy, skip. In sum, although Nightingale may not have achieved all of her goals during some war that I haven't heard about, her breadth of vision and ability to realize ambitious projects have earned her an eminent place among the ranks of social pioneers. So I read that last sentence partly because it's the last sentence of the passage, partly because it starts with the words in sum. So we're about to get a summary. And that's it. Those are the two parts. Those are the reasons that I read it. So what we skipped here was this part. Any questions or reactions to my suggested strategy here in terms of how to read a passage? I imagine some of you are very worried at this point about what we're going to do with the detailed questions. So don't worry, we're going to see that coming right up. But as far as deciding what to read and what not to read, is this clear, kind of how I make my decisions of what to read and what not to read? Okay. I sense that if I read everything, I'm going to be in trouble. I'm going to be distracted. I'm not going to be able to know why the author wrote the passage. I'm going to miss all of the big picture stuff because I'll get sucked into the details. So Salma is asking a good question. How do you force yourself to not read everything? It's hard because you've spent the last 20 years, probably on average, reading everything. You've never done this before, I imagine. And I think that it is something you have to force yourself to do when you're practicing at home. And as you force yourself to do it on one passage and another passage and another passage, what you'll start noticing is, hey, I'm doing better and better and better in reading comprehension. I'm doing much better than I ever did back in the day when I used to read the whole passage. So you kind of prove to yourself that this is the better strategy, but you do have to force yourself at first. And I think Salma is onto something. I don't think it's that hard for students to identify what they should read and what they should not read. I think that part is not hard. I think what's hard is to have the self-control to actually skip the stuff that you know you should skip. Do you agree, Salma? Like, is that the hard part? It's not the realizing what you should and what you shouldn't read. It's the, okay, I realize that I shouldn't read this, but I really want to read it. I'm worried that if I don't read it, I won't do well. Force yourself at first, and then you'll prove to yourself with time and practice that this is the better way to do it. All right, so let's look at some questions. We'll see how we deal with them. Starting with this one. The passage is primarily concerned with evaluating. I'm going to give you a minute to pick an answer, and you can feel free to plop your answer in the chat box. All right, so I'll stop you there. The most important words on the computer screen right now are these. These two words are going to allow me to be very aggressive in eliminating answer choices. Because there are going to be all sorts of answer choices with all sorts of details that I'm going to say, look, I didn't read the details, so I don't know if this detail was in the passage or not. But it's not the primary concern of the passage. If it's some detail that may be in there that I haven't seen, it's definitely not the primary concern. I know what the primary concern is because I specifically read the passage with that in mind, trying to understand what the primary concern is. And we can ask ourselves, do we agree with this word? Do you agree that the primary concern of the passage was to evaluate something? And if you agree that the author wanted to evaluate something, you tell me, what was the author interested in evaluating? And I'm going to be very aggressive now in eliminating answer choices. Did the author want to evaluate the importance of something? In other words, I just want to read the first couple of words of the answer choice. Let's do that to all of the answer choices. Maybe you can tell me in the chat box, what can we eliminate just based on what I have up here? What do you think we can eliminate? Stella, yes, we will, right after this passage. Good. So I agree with all of you said that we should eliminate ADE. Let me go ahead and do that. And I want you to remember on the test, you don't have to read the entire answer choice in order to eliminate it. You have to read the entire answer choice if you want to pick it. Okay? Don't just read the first couple of words and say, yep, I'm going to pick it. That's not okay. But if you want to eliminate the answer choice, you can do that just after reading the first two words if you feel confident that it's wrong. Now, B and C, they both start pretty good. So we will have to read a little bit further. Let's see how much further. Can I eliminate B now? Contrasting approaches to the writing. What do you think? Now can we eliminate B? Let's reveal a bit more of C. Contradictory accounts of Florence Nightingale's historical. What do you think? If we had to eliminate one of them now, what would you eliminate? Would you eliminate B or would you eliminate C at this point? Eliminate B. I agree with you. Eliminate B because the author wasn't evaluating contrasting approaches to the writing of something. It was evaluating, he was evaluating contrasting contrasting publications, contradictory accounts of Florence Nightingale's historical significance. So you read the entire answer choice, the one that I want to pick, I read it all the way to the end. Is there anything wrong with this answer choice? No. That's the right answer. All right, so takeaway from here is if you're looking at a primary purpose question, you are actually better off not having read any of the details. That's actually an advantage. And you can be very aggressive in eliminating answer choices. You don't have to read the answer all the way to the end in order to eliminate it. All right, let's look at the next one. All right, so this is also a primary concern, but this one is not the primary concern of the whole passage. It's just the primary concern of the very last paragraph. Why did the author give us the last paragraph? To tell us what he believes in and then justify. He believes this. Why does he believe it? Because of all of this stuff. So he's giving us justification for his belief. Was it to summarize the arguments about Nightingale from the first two paragraphs? No, that doesn't touch his belief at all. To refute the view of Nightingale's career presented in the preceding paragraph? No, he actually agrees with the preceding paragraph. Was it to analyze the weaknesses of it? Was it to analyze anything? Was he analyzing? Was this written in order to analyze something? I think I can eliminate C just based on the first word. Was it in order to cite evidence to support a view of Nightingale's career? This is written kind of confusing, and they did that on purpose because they want us to eliminate it. But this view is the direct match with I believe. And citing evidence is exactly what he does in the entire paragraph. He's citing the evidence to support his view of Nightingale's career. So D is the correct answer. This is a tough question because of the way in which they worded the correct answer. I'm not at all a fan of how they wrote it, but they have to do something to get people to pick the wrong answer. And then finally, no, it was not written in order to correct a factual error. So part of this is a process of elimination, and part of it is also looking at that paragraph and saying, well, why did he write this? He wrote it in order to tell us what his view is and why that is his view, to justify that view. Let's move on to the next one. So the strategy that I would suggest for a question like this is a combination of two things. There are going to be answer choices where we can just read the beginning of the answer choice and say, that's not true. Let me know in the chat box if you agree that this thing that I just put in a red box is not true. We know that that's not true. You agree? Or disagree? I mean, the evidence of Nightingale's letters, that's paragraph 2. Summers' conclusions, that's paragraph 1. It says by contrast. I mean, no, that's not right. So we can eliminate E, right? I think something similar in D. Would the author agree with this part? I mean, I can stop reading there and say, no, the author is a big fan of these editors. You agree with that as well? That we can eliminate D just based on those first few words? Okay, so D and E are gone. And so that's one part of the strategy, is to just identify those answer choices where just by reading the first line of text, you can see, no, that's not right. The second part of the strategy is to say, look, if you want the author to be most likely to agree with something, then you'd better say something that's not hard to agree with. The more specific an answer choice is, the harder it is for somebody to agree with it because it's very specific. And so, you know, I would say that the word misunderstood is something really specific. I mean, do we have reason to believe that the author believes that Summers misunderstood something? I know the author disagrees with Summers' conclusion, but do we have any reason to believe that he believes that Summers misunderstood something? It's very specific. Not enough to eliminate A, but certainly enough to guess away from A. Look at the word exaggerated. Does the author have reason to believe that the editors exaggerated something? As far as we know, the author is a big fan of the editors. Exaggerated is just such a specific thing to do, similar to misunderstood. Now, when I look at answer choice C, what does it say? Let's see. Although Summers' account of Nightingale's role in the Crimean War may be accurate, you know what that reminds me of? Actually, let me just do some color coding here. This part really reminds me of the author's summary that also started with the word although. And it also mentioned the Crimean War. You see that? Let's see if the second part also kind of matches that summary. What do you think? This with this. Is that a fairly good match? Cool. So a combination of a few things here in the strategy. One, I'm eliminating answer choices if I can, just based on the first few words. Two, I'm guessing away from answers that are incredibly specific and that I don't have a real reason to believe them. And three, when I'm kind of leaning towards a particular answer, in this case C, I'm asking myself, well, do I have anything in the passage that kind of connects with this? And I shouldn't need to hunt in the details when the question stem mentions the author. The author most likely to agree. The author isn't really a part of all of these details. These are just facts, 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 facts that happened, facts, facts, facts that happened. The answer to this kind of question shouldn't be in those details. It should be in one of the pieces that we actually read. So there are a lot of good reasons to only read the big picture stuff and completely ignore the specific stuff. All right, good. So I think we have 2 more questions on this passage. I'm getting a little bit concerned that we won't get to the second passage. So let's try to get through these last 2 fairly quickly. In the interest of time, I'm going to give you my strategy for this kind of question. I'm going to need to hunt for a word in the passage. The only word from this question stem that I think is worth hunting for is the word public. Not the word British, because I feel like I think she was in Britain, and we're talking about the British public, so I don't know that it'll say British. Much more likely that it'll say public. So I'm hunting, just hunting for the word public. I'm really just hunting in the details of paragraph 1 and in the details of paragraph 2. And as I hunt for the specific word public, I see it here. And so then once I've found the word that I hunted for, I read that whole sentence. Let's go ahead and read the whole sentence. And then once we've read it, pick your best guess. So you got it, Annie. It's A. She was highly respected. Her projects receiving popular and governmental support. How are you going to open a hospital in London without governmental support? How are you going to raise money from the public if you're not receiving popular meaning public support? So A is a direct match to this. B, C, D, E, we have no reason to pick any of those. So hopefully you're okay with that. I'm moving on. Last question for this passage. I just highlighted for you the appropriate part. Good. So Annie almost picked A and then realized it was a mistake. She says, during the Crimean War, but they focused after the Crimean War. So that's why it's not A. Can anybody in the chat box tell me what would you pick instead of A? Some of you are getting it. Good. Yeah, it's E. E is a direct match to this stuff that I have here in purple. One of you typed D in the chat box. I'll eliminate D for this reason. And this. We don't know any of that. So I guess a good takeaway for this question type is called according to the passage. That's the name of the question type. A good takeaway is when you are about to pick an answer, just make sure that every word in that answer is true. You can prove every word in that answer. It's possible that this was this thing. It's possible that it was the first facility. It's possible that it was a university. It's possible that it was a major university. All of that is possible, but I don't know that. I don't know any of that. So that would be a reason. Those all would be reasons to eliminate D. And A we can eliminate because it's talking about the survival of the British Army soldiers in hospitals during the Crimean War. No, that's not what it was about. It was about British barracks in peacetime, not a war. There's a mismatch there as well. All right, good. So let's look at a much harder passage. The passage that we just did was medium difficulty level. We're going to look at a hard one now. And same idea, same strategy. We're going to decide what to read, what not to read, and then try to answer some questions. Here you go. Okay, so that was 3 minutes again. Let me know in the chat box if that was enough or not. Hint, if it wasn't, that means you're reading too much. Just enough. Okay, good. So let's look at what we should read and what we should not read. The first two sentences are really dense and scientific. Stella, is this the kind of passage you were hoping to see? You're asking for a hard scientific passage. Very dense, but it's the very beginning of the passage, so I do want to read it, and I want to really understand it. So we're talking about a meteor stream. I don't exactly know what a meteor stream is or how it's created, but it looks like I'm about to get a lesson on that, whether I want to or not. It's composed of dust particles that have been ejected from a parent comet at a variety of velocities. Velocities is speeds, a bunch of different speeds. These particles follow the same orbit as the parent comet, but due to the differing velocities, they slowly gain on or fall behind the disintegrating comet until a shroud of dust surrounds the entire cometary orbit. So the entire, elliptical or circle or whatever it is, the orbit looks like, the entire orbit is going to be covered in dust. Okay, great. Thank you for that lesson, GMAT. But here is where it starts getting really interesting. Right? Astronomers have hypothesized that. So there's a hypothesis. Here's something else that's really interesting. And so I can tell what's going to come after that first part that I highlighted. I'm going to get the hypothesis from astronomers. I can tell what's going to come after that second highlighted part. It's going to be an explanation explaining the manner in which the recent computer modeling experiment tested the hypothesis. I'm not going to read the chunks of text because I already know why they're here and I know what they're doing. Right? So again, this first chunk of text that I'm erasing, that's going to describe what the astronomer's hypothesis is. The second part that I'm skipping, that's the part that's explaining how exactly is this recent computer model experiment, how is it testing the hypothesis. So we skip that. That's an interesting comment there in the chat box. How to get used to what to read and what not to read. When I start to read, I can't stop. If you find that you start to read and then you can't stop to read, that means you're just on autopilot. You see, if you're not on autopilot, if the stuff that you're reading, you're reading very, very slowly and thoughtfully, you get to the word by, you need to pause and say, okay, so after the word by, what are we going to get? I know what I'm going to get after the word by. I'm going to get the manner in which this thing tested this thing. So if you can't stop here, it's because you didn't want to stop. It's because you're not reading it slowly enough to think about what you're reading. You're not digesting it, and you're not trying to predict what's going to come next. That's what you want to change. So I think the answer to your question is read more slowly. Read more slowly and keep pausing and digesting and thinking about what, do I have any idea of what's going to come next? Do you all agree? Let me know in the chat box. Give me some feedback. Do you agree that after the word that here, we can tell what's going to come? I don't know exactly what the hypothesis is, but I can tell it's going to be that hypothesis. Same thing here after the word by. I don't need to read it to tell what it's for. It's going to tell me how is this done. In the model, the particles were randomly distributed. This seems like too technical. I don't want to read that. But this part is interesting. The researcher found, as expected, that, and I don't think I want to read what he found. I just want to know that it was expected. Okay, so the researcher using this computer modeling experiment found what he expected. Here's another interesting part coming up. Conventional theories, however, right? So there was something that was expected, but there was also something that was unexpected. Surprisingly, the computer model stream gradually came to resemble, I don't understand that part, but anyway, there's a surprise. So there's something that was expected and there was something that was a surprise. What exactly was expected, what exactly was a surprise, that's above my pay grade. Again, think about Steve Jobs. He doesn't understand computer hardware and software, so he's not interested in these parts in between. Whenever the Earth passes through a meteor stream, a meteor shower occurs. Right? That makes sense. Moving at a little over, I'm not going to read that. Blah, 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 details, details, details. There is no reason why the Earth should always pass through the stream's exact center. I don't know what that means. Skip. Has the predicted twin peaked activity? Look at that. Now, just reading the first few words of this paragraph, I can tell what the previous paragraph was saying. The previous paragraph predicted a twin peak activity. How do I know? Because of this part. So even though I skipped the entire previous paragraph, I now can summarize for you what it said. It predicted a twin peak activity. And we're asking, has it been observed for the actual yearly Geminid meteor shower? And then I'm getting some more details, details. That's it. So I'm really not reading the second and third paragraphs at all, but I spent a lot of time on paragraph number 1. Unfortunately, we don't have the time to answer the questions that came with this passage. I will say that they are incredibly hard. You can go on mba.com where they have free, they have free 15 questions of each type. So you'll find this passage with the questions that go with it there, and you can try them on your own. What I will say is that there are some cases where you have to just look at the timer and say, I'm going to guess. And so I'll give you an example of that. This one. So a ton of text in the question stem, a ton of text in each of the answer choices. And this question type is called an inference question. The passage suggests it means that the answer is not going to be explicitly stated in the passage. It's going to be something we can infer from the passage. So this is the kind of question where I would consider saving some time and just guessing and moving on. If you're new to the GMAT, you might not know that it's a computer adaptive test. The questions get harder and harder as we do well. If we do poorly, the questions get easier. And so because of that, the easier a question is, the more important it is. The harder a question is, the less important it is to our score, the less impact it will have. So I can tell that this is a hard question because it's inference, because it's a ton of text, and because the passage was clearly a very difficult passage, super technical. So this is the kind of question where I would say, you know what, I don't have time for this. I'm just going to move on to the next one. So just wanted to put that out there. And I do encourage you all to go home and try the questions that go with this passage. So it's time for takeaways. Number 1, we want to skip chunks of details if we know how they contribute to the passage. If I know why these details are coming up, then I don't need to read them. Number 2, don't read the answer choices until you're ready for them. So I'll remind you of that question where we hunted for the word public. We read everything there was to read about the public in that sentence, and then we read the answer choices. We don't read the answer choices ahead of time. When you do read the answer choices, eliminate as soon as you can confidently do so, even if it was just after the first word or after the first 2 words or after the first 4 words. You don't need to read the entire answer choice in order to eliminate it. You only need to read the entire answer choice in order to pick it. I'll remind you also, if you are going to pick it, just confirm every word in that answer choice is definitely, demonstrably true. Oh, that's what I just said. Before picking an answer, confirm that every word is demonstrably true. Thank you all for joining me here tonight. And best of luck on the GMAT. Salma is asking whether I would recommend in person or online. The online platform is similar to what you just saw, with the exception that you all would also be on a microphone and on a camera, just as I am. So I would see all of your faces, you would see all of each other's faces, and we would all just discuss. So it looks a lot like an in-person class, but it has a few advantages over an in-person class. For example, I can ask you to chat things to me privately. So, if you're shy, if you don't want other students in the classroom to see what you're asking, you can just send it in a private chat message to the instructor. That's something you would not be able to do in an in-person class. And then there's the obvious advantages that you're not constrained to the specific in-person courses where you live. You can be in your pajamas at home. You don't need to sit in traffic, etc. And you can have any instructor in the world. So all of those are advantages of online classes. In-person classes are in person. I think the advantages of those are obvious and speak for themselves. So it's up to you, Salma. I think it depends on the student. All right. Thank you all for joining me, and good luck. Have a good night.